7 months. I'm the co-director along with Dr. Valerie Hartnett of the Weaver Institute for Law Psychiatry here at the law school. And from time to time we put on discussions like this on various topics. Before I get to that, let me please do a plug for the fact that there are any first-year students in here. The Weaver Institute right now is actively seeking applications for Weaver fellowships. The fellowship would begin in the second year and continue in the third year. It currently pays a stipend of about $4,200. There are some obligations that Weaver fellows have, including taking certain classes, like my class in law and psychiatry, and also Professor Stefani's class that's taken in conjunction with the forensic psychiatric residents, our fellows. And the other thing is actually an opportunity for the past year to work in various courts in Hamilton County that deal with issues particularly regarding mental health. So if you're interested at all in applying for a Weaver fellowship, go to the webpage, go to the Weaver Institute part of the webpage, and you'll see the application there. And the application should be filled out along with a writing sample, a transcript of your grades. It doesn't have to be certified. We'll believe you if you just give your transcript. And a statement as to why you have some interest in mental health law. And so with those three things, if you get more copies, and then we lost it up on the fourth floor, we'll do an evaluation and make a selection. The deadline for the Weaver fellowships is April the 15th this year. And we should have designation within about 2 weeks after that, so you know who you're going to be. All right. Mass slayings, mental illness. When Professor Stefani and Dr. Hartnett and I kicked this topic around earlier in the year, we thought that we would have some interest in it, and certainly there is. And what I tried to do is assemble a panel for discussion purposes, and I would invite you to step in at any point in the discussion, ask questions, or make comments that you might have. But let me introduce you to our panel for a minute. I've already mentioned Professor Stefani over here on the your right, my left. He's Director of Legal Didactics for the Forensic Psychiatry Fellowship at the university. He's also an adjunct professor, like I am. Mike Curtin is the Director of Public Safety and the Chief of Police for the University of Cincinnati. Certainly there are issues that come up with regard to safety and those types of things in these types of situations. So we're happy to get Chief Curtin with us here today. In the middle, Dr. Douglas Mossman. Dr. Mossman is a board-certified forensic psychiatrist. He is the professor of psychiatry and the program director for the Forensic Psychiatric Fellowship at the University College of Medicine. He's been an expert witness in numerous cases. He's written extensively and is an expert in the area of dangerousness and mental illness. Next to him is Dr. Hartnett. Dr. Hartnett is, as I mentioned, co-director of the Weaver Institute with me. She's also a professor of philosophy and psychology, and she's a scholar in residence here at the Weaver Institute. Her current research is into neuroscience of violence and its implications both for our understanding of the human nature and also the criminal justice system. The other thing I can tell you on a personal note is that Dr. Hartnett was at Virginia Tech when that unfortunate event occurred. That still, I think, sets the record for the most killings in a mass slaying since 56, I think, students were killed. Finally, Dr. Scott Bressler. Dr. Bressler is Clinical Director of Forensic Psychiatry at the University of Cincinnati Department of Psychiatry. He, like Dr. Mossman, has been an expert witness on numerous occasions. He has treated the mentally ill and people who may have some propensity for violence, and is certainly an expert in that field. When we put this program together, I asked the Weaver fellows to do a little research. And what we did, when we started with the Columbine killings in April 20th, 1999, and it brought them forward. How many mass slayings have there been since Columbine in 1999, up to and including the unfortunate occurrence at Newtown this past December? 30. 30 mass slayings. And that's in this country alone. All right? Now, I'm not going to say that this is necessarily a scientific survey, but I went through the information that we gleaned from these various events, and to me it looks like there was psychiatric overlay, if you will, in at least 20 out of the 30 instances. And it sort of surprised me, I have to say, because in my law psychiatry class, one of the principles, or at least one of the things we talk about, is the fact that mentally ill people aren't any more dangerous than the general population, I think. Now, if I'm wrong about that, I'm sure you guys will step in. But I'm wondering, when you take the subset of manslayers, is there some relationship between mental illness and, those particular types of behavior? So, with that in mind, I'm going to turn the proceedings first over to Dr. Mossman and Dr. Ressler to discuss the issue of dangerousness and how it pertains to manslaying. So.
All right. Well, first, Jim, thank you very much for inviting me here. I'll talk a little bit about mental illness and violence eventually during the 2 or 3 minutes I want to take to speak to you, at least at the opening. But what I think it's important to keep in mind throughout all of this is that talking about mental illness and mass slayings is a little bit like talking about and saying that tuberculosis is just a disease of lungs. Now, for those of you who don't know, around 1900, the average lifespan in this country was 47 years, as opposed to about 80 as it is now. And the reason is lots of people died of lots of things, including tuberculosis. But tuberculosis is a disease of poverty. And as poverty went down in the 20th century, well before antibiotics became available, the rate of tuberculosis dropped. And if one follows that rate, even after antibiotics became available, then you can see that antibiotics had just a small impact on things. The reason I bring up this point is that, as Professor Hunt mentioned, there have been 200 or 300 people killed by mass killings over the last 15 years or so. And the most recent one that everyone heard about was 26 killings in Connecticut on a single day at a single school. But how many people here know how many people die by firearms every day in the United States? It's 80. So as awful as 26 deaths concerned, that's not the average number of killings by firearms in the United States every day. Firearms are a public health problem, and they're not a problem related to mental illness, except to the extent that people with mental illness are among the people who are in the population. To really address the problem of mass shootings, one has to think about the kinds of public health measures that we've undertaken successfully in the United States to deal with the dangers of driving and to deal with smoking. Okay? The deaths by driving per mile driven in the United States have dropped 90% since I was a little boy. The reason is not that we drive better now than we did when I was a little boy. But the reason is that cars are much safer. It's much harder to kill yourself if you're in a crash. When I was a little boy, by the way, seat belts weren't regularly installed in cars, to just think of a simple, inexpensive mechanism. The rate of smoking in the United States has dropped by half since I was a child. It used to be over 40%, it's now around 20%. When I was a kid, and even before that as well, it was very common for romantic and main characters in movies to smoke cigarettes. It was glamorous. That's why my mother started to smoke, along with many other people of her generation. Now, some of you may smoke, but none of you think that it's glamorous. There's been a very successful public health campaign that has made everyone aware of the dangers and problems and non-glamorousness of smoking. And as a result, there are far fewer smoking deaths and far fewer people smoking. In a gathering like this 40 years ago, some people would be smoking. That was common behavior. Nobody would think about doing that now, even if it were allowed in the room. Well, firearms are a public health problem too. And it's very glamorous. Lots of heroes on TV and in movies kill lots of people. If you think about all the famous movies involving men that you've seen in the last 30 years, they're mostly about men solving problems with guns. What a surprise then that we'd find problem-plagued people who would see guns as one of the solutions for solving their problems. People with mental illness probably do have a statistically higher rate of acting violently than people who are sociodemographically matched, notwithstanding what Professor Hunt told you correctly about what he learned 30 years ago when we didn't know that that's the case. But it's a small statistical association. People with mental illness account for about 4% of the violence towards others in this country. The mass shootings in this country have amounted to 100 to 200 deaths a year. As awful as that is, there are 11,000 deaths by firearms. There are far more school shootings than you ever hear about on national news broadcasts. And more people die by killing themselves with firearms than die by than there are deaths from people killing each other by firearms. The suicide rate by firearms, and suicide is an impulsive action that people think about typically for just a few minutes before they do it. The suicide rate by firearms in this country is 18 or 19,000 a year. It would be far less if people didn't have a readily and highly effective lethal means to undertake that. So I'll acknowledge that there's a connection, and in some of the individual clinical consulting work that Dr. Bressler and I do to people like Mr. Curitin here, and to other people, we talk about the connection between their mental problems and what they might do, because our function as clinicians, as psychiatrists and psychologists, is to think about individuals and intervening there. But to really think about the problem of deaths by shootings in the United States, we need to think about all of them, not just the ones that make national news regularly, and to think about the problem of deaths by firearms as a public health problem.
Thank you, Dr. Watson. Dr. Bressler, you can say what you want, but one question I have, what about, is there some comment about preventions or something we talk about along those lines? But you say what you want. We have the floor.
Just a couple of moments to share some ideas with you folks here. First of all, let's talk about the Connecticut killings. The Connecticut killer is really a bad poster child for this whole topic. This is not somebody who woke up one day and decided to go down to the store and buy a couple of firearm pieces and then go perpetrate a killing. This is a person who started this spree kill essentially with a matricide, with killing his mother. The weapons were not his. The weapons belonged apparently to his mother, from what we know. So the weapons were stolen. He goes and he kills innocents, and we all know the story with that. He comes from an affluent family. It's not like this person, lacked resources to get treatment for any kind of mental illness. His father is extremely wealthy, and they lived in great affluence in Connecticut. And the whole ordeal ends with a suicide. Starts with a matricide, ends with a suicide, and then there are these innocent kids that are killed in between, unfortunately. Now, another piece I want to make a comment on, and this is about the mentally ill in the United States, in this country. In the late 60s, a lot of these folks were living in institutions. And with all of the desire for people to have their civil rights, and there were many civil rights movements that emerged in the late 60s, another one had to do with keeping mentally ill people in society as a whole. Great idea, but what happened was they went and they closed down all these mental institutions. A phenomenon that's referred to as deinstitutionalization. And they took the most vulnerable of these people and they set them up with housing predominantly in inner cities, which can be violent, rife with people that have substance abuse problems, and where we get into trouble is when mentally ill people are also substance abusers. Okay? That's where we see the numbers or the percentage or the greater risk occurring for mentally ill people to act out. So we take the most vulnerable people, we drop them into the inner city. We don't provide the resources they need for good treatment. They're living in dangerous areas. Guess what? They start drinking and doing crack and smoking dope and doing all kinds of stuff as well. Heroin, right? Now we got double trouble. And then maybe they start engaging in various types of antisocial acts to support their habits. Now we got triple trouble. You see the picture here? My question for you, at the risk of being somewhat provocative, is why should we deprive these people of their right to own a gun? I live in the suburbs, and I own a gun, right? Why can't these people have the right to defend themselves? And who's going to wrap these people out and say, hey, these people are mentally ill. They can't have the civil liberties to own a gun to protect themselves. Why? Because some guy dresses up as a joker and goes into a theater and starts shooting innocent people? And the guy happened to be in, we'll find out a lot more about him because he's mentally ill. These other people that are responsible gun owners. So just a little provocative talk. AJ and I talked about it to the wee hours last night about this topic. So think about that and pose questions.
Okay. Any comments yet from the audience?
Just so I understand what you just posed to us correctly, did you just go through, now we're at triple trouble, and so that, to me, I think you're indicating that they're dangerous people when you say that, right? And you're asking why those triple trouble dangerous people, we should deprive them of the right to have guns.
You ever walk in South Philly? You ever walk in some of the neighborhoods I grew up in?
I just want to know if that's who you're talking about. You're talking about people
Exactly what I'm
who are
talking
who are the most trouble. As
We
you
have
said.
lots of people that live in our community, okay, who get treated for mental illness, that abuse substances, okay?
And I think the parallel he's drawing is that this is not the profile of an individual who's committed one of the 30 mass shootings over the last 14 years. It's not the down and out drug user who suddenly decides to wake up, become, and is paranoid and decides to go on a shooting spree. It's Adam Lanza. It's people who are educated, largely affluent, largely have the means and the wherewithal to put together a plan. Okay, so those are the individuals committing the mass shootings, not necessarily the down and out drug users, who probably need more of a means of defense than anything else.
Well, getting back to the issue of prevention, Chief, I mean, would you tell us a little bit about what happens here at the University of Cincinnati in terms of mental illness and the potentially dangerous people? I mean, that kind of topic.
The short answer is a lot happens. I'm split between, I spent 36 years with the City of Cincinnati Police Department, where mass shootings were looked at as an event to respond to. On college campuses, these incidents are looked at as something that we can prevent because there's all kinds of markers and cues and breadcrumbs along the way that a student probably could report, or a faculty member could report, or a staff member could report, and someone could report something that appears out of order for a particular situation, but they need some place to place that information, sometime in confidentiality, sometime anonymously, so that it can be addressed. And so on college campuses, University of Cincinnati in particular, we have what's called a prevention through intervention team, of which Dr. Ressler is a member, that when we get information that cannot be handled sort of at the teacher, instructor, dean's level, but clearly there are some behaviors that are alarming, that we need to take additional action that goes before this team of psychologists, psychiatrists, attorneys, student affairs, public safety. We kind of collectively look at all of the circumstances, all of the information that we have, and then try to find some appropriate intervention to prevent this person from doing something like a mass murder. That's very difficult. Those intervention tools have to be customized to the situation. And so on the one hand, we look at what can we do with this person that's been identified as someone that could do something dastardly. We also have to look at protecting the student or the faculty member who feels vulnerable because of this. And so we have tools to, on the one hand, protect them, as well as we have an obligation to protect the university as an entity, which is also new, at least for me, coming to a college campus from a municipal setting. It kind of splits this police model down the middle. Most police models are known as a professional model or a traditional model. But then there's this community policing model that seeks to have that informal relationship between the police and the citizens. And so when it comes to mass shootings, where we look at statistically where do they happen, what's wrong with that person, what kind of weapon are they likely to use, so where pistols is the weapon of choice, in particular on college campuses, not assault rifles. What you do with a pistol is a piece of the issue. The institutionalization is another piece of the issue, and wherever you come down on that, on a college campus, the idea is get the information early, analyze it, and take some appropriate steps to prevent it from occurring. The city of Cincinnati is always looking at, we've got the event, we're responding to it, and it's really force on force at that point.
This initiative, if I may add, Chief, this initiative of having threat assessment teams at universities in particular occurred after Virginia Tech. And what happened was there were a lot of governors that were mandating that these threat assessment teams should be set up at universities in their respective states. And of course, that was ordered by our governor at the time, and we responded as well as other schools in the state.
Well, let me say, as an outsider coming into that process, it is a weak process. It is uneven. The threat assessment teams from Colorado to Connecticut to Cincinnati, in terms of the tools that are available for this threat assessment team to effectively intervene to mitigate whatever the threat is, from counseling to incapacitation. So it's really something that needs a great deal of attention from my perspective. And the fact that you have a threat assessment team is great, but the quality and the interventions that are available for that team really, really, really needs a lot of attention.
What kind of people, I don't mean names of people, but I mean, are they all law enforcement, or are they social workers? Or
On the team itself?
Yeah, on the team.
Well, certainly, the chief runs the team.
Yeah.
I sit on that team. We have our legal representation on the team. We have a security specialist who used to run international security for a large corporation. Now he's at a hospital.
Student affairs.
Yeah.
Okay, all right.
And they have the counseling center.
So if a student would have a concern, they contact the police department? Is that the best thing to do, Chief, or what?
Well, that sounds like call 911 for all your problems. But no, they should first go to a faculty member.
Okay.
Or staff member, because they would have an understanding of the persons you're talking about.
Yeah.
If you just call the police and say somebody's acting strange, we've got to do a lot of interviewing. But if they go to a faculty or a staff person that also knows this person, that could, number one, confirm their suspicion or their concern. Because what we would look like is just one person making this comment. It is always helpful that there's 4 or 5 people in a project that are saying, this person's part of our project, and projects have never gone this bad because of this behavior. And then we can involve, or they can involve the faculty member in that before it escalates up to all those steps have been taken, and then our team begins to look at all those things.
They can come through dorm advisors, it can come through teachers that take it to deans. There's different ways that it will work its way back to the threat assessment team. It's Big Brother, baby. It's a lot.
And we're talking about Virginia Tech. Professor Arcastle, you were there. I mean, first of all, did you know this particular, was his name Joe?
So Sung-Wee Cho, yeah, I was an associate dean at the time in the College of Liberal Arts and Human Sciences, and Sung-Wee Cho was one of our students. 11 of the people who were killed were members of my college, and we lost 6 faculty members and several students. So it was very much a part of what I did. And, you know, there's a lot I could say about it, but one thing I want to say is it is true that we didn't have threat assessment teams back then. We didn't have a lot of things back then, and even though it was only 6 years ago, we didn't even have cell phone coverage inside the buildings. The doors didn't lock from inside the rooms because that was considered a fire hazard. The door handles were such that you could chain them closed. I mean, there were a lot of things, when you look back, it's kind of like when you were a kid and nobody wore seatbelts. You think, well, that's just kind of loony that we never thought about these sort of easily preventive measures. But I actually think with the Sung-Wee Cho case, and it wouldn't surprise me that other cases are like this, this was a case where I believe, in a sense, everything was done right. But if you're really determined to kill a bunch of people and you're willing to die in the process, you'll be successful. So we knew Sung-Wee Cho was mentally ill. Faculty had taken him to the counseling center. The counseling center had treated him. The courts had declared him incompetent and had mandated outpatient services. He was engaged in those outpatient services. It's my opinion, and of course, you know, I can only give you my opinion. If we'd had a threat assessment team, it would not have made any difference. Because the thing about Sung-Wee Cho, and maybe about the other people, or some of them anyway, there was nothing in his profile that suggested violence. He'd never behaved violently toward others. In fact, his problem was that he seemed to be completely shut down. And a lot of the faculty whom I talked to after this incident told me they thought that since he was of Korean descent, that he had English as second language issues, and that he couldn't communicate effectively in English. And that was how they saw the problem. Other people saw someone a little more troubled, which is how he ended up in the counseling center. He lived in the dormitories. He had 2 roommates. The 2 roommates thought he was very quiet, but they had no idea that he was stockpiling weapons, that he was engaged in any of this planning. This is not a case in my mind of somebody who slipped through the cracks. I think the right people were aware that something was going on. It's just very hard sometimes to crawl inside someone's head and see exactly what they're seeing as they're seeing it. But to Doug Mossman's point, the one place where I think our system was really broken was in the state of Virginia, the Commonwealth of Virginia. You can purchase firearms even though you have been declared incompetent by the court system and sentenced to involuntary treatment. And I think that actually is a mistake. But that's the only place where I can point to, and unfortunately the laws have not changed since that tragedy in Virginia, where I could say that's an intervention that could have made a difference.
Well, how about that? I mean, Dr. Breslow on the other hand says, well, you know, why shouldn't these people have the right to same civil liberties that everybody else has, including Second Amendment rights for guns? And so, Chief, do you have a comment about that? What's your position?
Well, my controversial opinion is not to regulate guns, but to regulate ammunition. Much like we regulate gasoline prices, that's influenced the automobile industry, that if the scarcity of ammunition is really scarce and the cost of a bullet is really, really high, it limits some of the activity, I believe. You can't get a bullet, you can have whatever kind of gun you want. So my 2 cents worth on this whole issue is you can have whatever kind of gun you want. Getting a bullet is not covered by the Constitution.
Well, so we've mentioned a couple times now the stockpiling of weapons, and actually I think to your point about the scarcity of bullets or the possibility of that, as I understand it, the perpetrators of the Columbine slayings had not only stockpiled weapons but also made homemade explosives. And so I guess my question is, what is the relationship or the impact of mental illness as far as stockpiling or creating weapons, clearly with the purpose of perpetrating this kind of killing. Because Dr. Bressler, as you mentioned, that this is not something where people are just waking up and deciding to go do it. I mean, there are multiple instances where they're stockpiling multiple weapons, automatic weapons, and weapons that can cause serious damage and making explosives.
Let me just get back to a statement I made earlier. The reason I stated about mentally ill people and do they have a right to own weapons is because at some point, I guess you have to draw a line. I mean, we certainly draw a line saying that convicted felons cannot be in possession of firearms, but miraculously they somehow find them. People that want to find weapons are going to find weapons. So the issue of a mentally ill person who's been civilly committed because of either dangerousness to self or others, whether they should have the right to own weapons, that's going to be, that's a discussion. It's a big discussion. And then what do mental health professionals do when we push papers and say that a person should be deprived of their civil liberties and be committed to a civil psychiatric hospital or some other place? And what the implications are for that. It just, I don't know if we quite know what the implications are. I think that it might keep people who are mentally ill, who feel threatened and want to own a weapon, from coming into the hospital, perhaps, when they need help. I just think we need to have a broader, discussion, about this. Certainly, some elements of mental illness, like paranoid psychosis, in which you can be somewhat obsessive over certain ideas, but have it together enough where you could put together a plan and then stockpile weapons, that poses a different risk. I was at University of Nebraska. I assessed a guy who drove onto the campus with an AK-47 assault rifle, burst through the doors of his classroom, and said to everyone there, "You're dead." Pulled the trigger and the gun jammed. Okay? I wrote about this case and published on this some years ago. He had hypoparathyroidism, and his brain, when they took pictures of it, looked like a stalactite cave because he had protrusions of calcium, jutting into various aspects of his brain. Okay? So it really, it depends. I think, and maybe AJ, you could talk more about this, but because we talked about it last time, I think we're fooling ourselves into thinking that we can arrest the problem of firearms in this country. We're fooling ourselves. I mean, this country's awash in firearms. And I think that we are trying to basically, put a Band-Aid on what is a problem where you really have a breach in a dam in a very, very large river. That's my view. We talk. Maybe you want to share some.
Yeah, these stories are fascinating to us because they're quintessential, man bites dog stories, right? Nobody's interested in the dog bites man story, but when man bites dog, that's interesting, that's newsworthy. So we're not focused on the 80 people who die every day through the ordinary misuse of handguns, but we're fascinated by the periodic mass shootings. It's interesting to ask, why are we focused on the exceptional rather than the ordinary? And one of the things I've come up with is that we're very much motivated by basic human emotions. And we fear irrational violence much more than easily understood rational violence. The idea of the out-of-his-mind crazy shooter who goes off on a rampage. Whenever these shootings happen, what's the first question we ask? Why? Why did they do this? We want to know why. And so much of the after story is this continuing search for a motive we can understand. reasons that are accessible to us in our kind of ordinary human experience. And I think that, and I hate to agree with kind of a lot of what the rest of the panel is saying, but the whole mental illness angle is in many ways a big red herring, because it's an attempt to kind of locate a reason. Okay, their brain was sick. You know, there was something wrong with their brain, and then the guy with stalactites, you know, in the PET scan. Maybe that is a good explanation. But there's another explanation, and it's one that we don't necessarily like. Quite frankly, it's kind of boring, and that's the idea that some people are evil. You know, that some people who are dead set on killing large amounts of people with weapons are just evil, and they're going to do it. And to me, it basically boils down to that fundamental question. Do you accept the idea that people can be evil? Because once you do, and I'm not saying you have to accept it, if you don't accept it, then we can look at how to treat everything. You know, then we turn to the experts and say, well, how do you treat our bad feelings and our bad motives and our bad impulses and our bad everything? Okay, because you can help us. But if you accept that evil exists, then I think the only thing that you can do is to reduce its potency. And then that gets to the question of firearms.
Well, my perspective is somewhat different in that I think the interest is because the victims were innocent. And so when I see the mass shooting, my sense of being a victim goes up, because the places and the locations where these incidents are happening are places that I'll go to. I'm not an evil person, and I don't know any evil people, and I don't think there's any evil people in this room. But that doesn't take away that it's these kinds of rooms, these kinds of settings, where a group of innocent people become the victim on such a huge scale. And so in our day-to-day lives, the places we go, to school, to movie theaters, to shopping malls, when we start seeing those places hunting grounds where we go, I think from the police perspective, when we talk to our victims, it's that piece that's resonating with them. They don't care about the guy. Victims of crime, particularly property theft, they don't care about the perpetrator. They care about getting their stuff back. Victims of robbery, you know, if I get my stuff back, you know, that's okay. All right. But when you have mass shootings, in our statistics in law enforcement, there's been 84 of these in 10 years between 2000 and 2010. Dr. Blair just did this report for law enforcement that talks about these mass shootings where there was no attempt to gain anything other than just to kill. And that attacks a person's sense of innocence and your vulnerabilities. I mean, how do you protect yourself from going to the movie or going to school and suddenly you're on the 6 o'clock news? That's what I think people are bothered by.
I think you bring up a good point, Chief. You know, it's the context of where it occurs that really, I think, adds to, you know, the facet on manifestation of the end.
And I think an additional piece of that is, I mean, and maybe this is just echoing what AJ said, but when you look at the people who have substance abuse problems, who are living in the inner city, it's a violent place to begin with, they get firearms, you're not surprised if violence is a result. But, and you have, even if you're not engaged in that, there's a sense in which you can see how to solve the problem. Get these people in treatment, get them better health care. You know, there's a whole bunch of social things that we can do to alleviate this problem. Whether we're doing them or not, we at least can see the solution. But the problem with people like Sung-Wee Cho is we can't predict that, not in the same way. There was not, as I said, there's nothing about Sung-Wee Cho that suggested he was going to be violent to others. The reason he was civilly committed is they were worried about suicide, violence to self. And I think that's what we find so troubling. It's not just that innocent people get killed, but we don't have a good way, with all of our threat assessment teams and everything else, of really predicting who's going to be doing this until it's usually too late.
One question that I have, maybe for the chief or anybody else who knows, is that kind of my own, law and order inspired, infused criminology knowledge said that people don't ramp up to super violent crimes right away. They don't go from 0 to 100. That you progress along a stage of increasingly violent crimes, that you don't just kind of wake up and your first crime is a murder. That never happens. But I was going through the profile that the Weaver fellows kind of put together, and one of the similarities, one of the commonalities throughout them was a remarkable lack of priors. I mean, a lot of these people had never been in trouble with the law before. And that really surprised me. And so is that...
Well, they did go from 0 to 100.
They go from 0 to 100. So is there any kind of insight into...
They go to 0 to 100. If you look at the FBI
Yeah.
research on many of these, what you find is that there's a significant planning stage, and they often project by speaking specifically as to what their intentions are prior to carrying it out. And so that's when the FBI has responded by saying, people need to come forward.
So I mean, the idea of articulating violent thoughts. It's my understanding that in psychotherapy, that's part of what you are supposed to be doing, is getting people to articulate their violent thoughts on the idea that by doing it in a therapeutic environment, in a safe environment, they're less likely to act upon it outside of that setting.
Well,
But now
that
I'm
may or
hearing...
may not be true. I mean,
Okay.
my favorite scene from A Clockwork Orange, when he's reading about the Passion of Christ and he sees himself as the Roman soldier, who's contributing to the suffering of Jesus as he walks to his crucifixion. I mean, there's a subgroup of these people, as you said, that are bad dudes.
Jim, excuse me, I believe there's some questions.
Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I'd like to take you guys back off my Clockwork Orange and to the preventative measures that you described at college campuses now. I was a freshman when Virginia Tech happened, and so I didn't go through orientation after the fact. Do they let students know about these programs that you put in place?
There is a flyer that is passed out. It's in the lobby of public safety. And as I'm finding out, orientation has too much
A lot of
stuff.
flyers, yeah.
Yes, and so we're working on booster orientations around customized topics, but could we do a better job of publicizing that the service is there? Absolutely.
In the front, or, I'm sorry. Yes, sir, in the back.
I have some questions for Dr. Moslin, or there are three related questions. You said that...
You've got 3 questions for
Three
me?
related questions.
Okay, well, let's see if I can remember more than one of them.
Number one, you said suicide was largely a matter of impulse. How could you know that? Number two, how could anybody know that? Number two, why is impulse control a public health problem rather than a moral one? And number three, was World War II a public health problem?
Okay, first, the reason we know that people with suicide, who commit suicide, tend to not think about doing it for very long before they undertake an action. Again, it's not everybody, but they never. Now, I'm not talking about where it may or may not have occurred, but between the moment when they started to think about it and the moment that they take some action. The reason we know about that is that lots of people don't succeed in killing themselves, fortunately, and you can then go ask them what happened. Okay?
All right, I thought that would be the answer.
All right. Impulsiveness as a public health problem is the next question, right?
How do you distinguish between impulsiveness as a public health problem and as a moral problem?
Well, okay, first, there's a lot that I could say about that, but first, my job as a physician is to talk about health-related matters. What I said before is that we recognize that auto accidents and smoking were public health problems, and we undertook public health measures. In effect, public health measures addressed lots of infectious diseases. It's not because of antibiotics. Yes, vaccines help, but those are broad public health measures, not interventionist medical measures afterward. We know that people are impulsive. They're just people who are impulsive. And if one is concerned about the danger that that creates, one takes actions that'll mitigate that danger. All right? The last question about World War II, I really didn't quite follow where you were going with that, and if you want to elaborate the question a little bit more, I'll see if I can make a better response.
Basically, his observation, the man on my right, there are some people who are simply evil and you can't do anything about it.
Well, again, that's A.J. Stefani. And Mr. Stefani's perspective is a reasonable moral perspective. It's not really useful, though, for a mental health professional to try to undertake explanations in terms of evil, because evil is not an explanation, it's a characterization. It's not an explanation. It's like many, many years ago when I was a little boy and Sid Caesar would play a psychiatrist and he'd tell the parents, "You got a rotten kid." I mean, that's not what mental health professionals or scientists do. If you want to know about someone's moral qualities, talk to a philosopher or talk to a minister. But mental health professionals are in the business of trying to explain how things happen. That's our job. That's a scientific explanation. It is not a moral characterization. So if you want to ask about the quality of something, I certainly have views about morality, but insofar as I'm functioning as a physician, that's not really relevant. You come to me for some other kind of explanation.
So Doug, would you say that there are times when it is appropriate to ask a psychiatrist, why did this happen? And there are times when it's appropriate to ask a philosopher, why did this happen?
I think it depends on what kind of answer you want. But I would say that saying that it's evil is not an explanation. It's not an answer to a why question. We already know it's evil, okay? Unless you have some question about that, but I don't think you do.
Well,
and saying some people are just bad is not an explanation.
Of course, we can relabel it, repackage it, and say, well, actually, they're a psychopath.
Here's the point about saying is, when we say that somebody's a psychopath, then we are placing the action in. It's really bad when I have to discuss philosophical topics next to a philosopher. But I had an undergraduate major in philosophy.
So tell us about tautology.
There's a very interesting issue in epistemology, which I won't go about explanation. But when we talk about saying that somebody is a psychopath, or we discuss the impact of a very unusual endocrine syndrome on someone, we are placing the action in a context in which it seems like it makes more sense. Or in case of psychopathy, that this is not just one isolated thing, but occurs in somebody who has a particular type of thing that is wrong with him. So it might have some informativeness to that degree.
But you could also say a psychopath is a really bad dude and be almost entirely accurate.
Except for when you were incorrect, which would be in a lot of cases.
Let's go down in the back and then go ahead. Yeah.
I have a question then. It seems like you're suggesting that all problems can be solved then.
Of course, no. No, solve. You can try to address certain problems. Some of us have religious beliefs which tell us that's what we're here on earth to do. Many of the rest of us agree. But it's not to try to finish the work, but to try to do it.
I guess to clarify, I'm hearing between firearms seems to be some of the argument, evil. Nobody seems to be arguing that mental illness is the problem. I think, for the most part, other than the one comment about the stalactites, kind of got me confused because then it was almost like you were suggesting that's why you brought the AK-47.
Well, that's not a mental illness.
Okay.
That's not a mental illness.
Deficiency, I guess. Then. It was totally separate.
At this stage, let us know. Say yes. You or no?
Give me the question.
If you find a structural brain
I was following along and I got confused a little bit when you talked about the guy walking with the AK-47 that jammed, or we had this the last
Well,
time.
I'm giving you an example of someone who is psychotic.
Okay, but it wasn't mental illness.
And tried to perpetrate, a mass killing, and we had a causal explanation as to what caused the psychotic thinking with him, and whether it's stalactite from calcium that he's absorbing in his own body, or it's from neurochemical changes that occur because they have a genetic vulnerability to schizophrenia.
But there's a causal relationship.
Right.
I understand. So I guess it goes back to with the, at Virginia Tech, say he obtained the gun, or say, if they took away guns altogether, so removed, because you said that you don't think anything else would have prevented it other than he was able to access firearms. So say he couldn't access firearms, we took that away as a cause, then he can make improvised explosive devices, he can do other things. I mean, is there any, at some point that we just decide that there was no way to solve that problem? Or do you think there's always a way to solve it?
Well, right, I don't think, as I said, I think if you are determined to kill a large number of people and you're willing to die and to fulfill that goal, we'll have a hard time stopping you. But I'm kind of with Doug that I do think there are things that we could do that can make it more difficult. So if we follow the chief's suggestion and make it difficult to acquire rounds of ammunition, then it probably would not be likely that Sun Wee Cho had 600 rounds of ammunition in his backpack when he went to the second floor of the building where he shot everybody. If you don't have 600 rounds, then you're just not going to be able to kill as many people. Or if they actually, mental health is part of the background check they do in Virginia, and there is some sort of flag if you've been civilly committed, then that might have prevented him from acquiring the 4 guns he had, and maybe he could only, scrounge up 1. And then that too would have made it perhaps more difficult for him to kill and injure as many people as he did. So it's like that.
We take actions all the time that I think I'm amazed that we don't see this more than what we do, right? We take actions all the time with police agencies to prevent people from killing themselves or killing other people and then maybe killing themselves afterwards, right? Those stories are not covered. And when I say we, I mean mental health professionals that work with law enforcement. I have my colleagues that work with the FBI, with the Secret Service, with the Capitol Police. We're doing this all the time. You don't know about it. You don't see it. Chief and I, we're working together. There are people that are acting strange in a classroom, maybe acting somewhat hostile towards a teacher. We're making phone calls, we're figuring things out, we're getting them into treatment, right? They change. And you don't hear that story. You hear nothing about that. And that's all behind the scenes of stuff that we're doing all the time.
One of the things that I might suggest, and I would like to see, I was, as an attorney who works with psychiatrists and has worked with many of the inpatient psychiatrists here at University Hospital for years, one of the things that surprised me with many of the inpatients who come in for short-term stays or psychiatrists and part of the treatment team who would ask about weapons, firearms in the home. And specifically ask the person, do you have firearms at home, if there was a suspicion or a risk that they might have access to it. And then there was some questioning of the family about whether there were firearms in the home. But it seemed to me that the treatment team was remarkably powerless about doing anything about it. All they could do was recommend to the family, hey, it's really not a good idea to have a loaded weapon in the home after we discharge your son and he comes home and he's recovering from a major psychotic break. That's probably not a really good idea. But short of that, there was really nothing they could do about it. And that surprised me. That was kind of sad. I would be hopeful that it would be a clinical indicator of dangerousness, and that they would be able to do something more than simply recommend to the family, hey, you better get rid of your loaded guns.
There was a question behind Brandon, Lily, and Brandon. Go ahead.
This isn't addressed to anyone in particular, but in reference to the mass shootings, we were saying, we always ask why, but my question is why now and not 30 years ago and prior to that? I mean, we had violent movies, we had westerns, I'm ignorant when it comes to purchasing guns, so I don't know if there's more availability of assault rifles. That's more my question, is why has this happened over the past 20 years?
It hasn't.
It's just
Statistically,
been
it's pretty much the same number of
No
mass
mass
shootings.
shootings.
What's
I don't
different?
remember hearing of them.
What's different from 30 years ago is the ability to get news about all kinds of things.
Instantaneously, we know about it.
Yeah.
Question back here, questions, go ahead.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like a lot of the mass shootings take place at schools. And if that is the case, does that tell us?
Workplace. It happens in the workplace.
There were, of the 30 that we looked at, there were 7 from schools. I didn't count up the workplace or the shopping malls, but there were a number of those as well, right?
The schools are less than 20%, but most of them are in the workplace.
The workplace ones today, is there some stronger association between the person who perpetrates them and the people that they kill? Because it seems like in the school shootings, they're
You get disgruntled employees that come in, they want to exact revenge. They also get domestic violence that bleeds over into the workplace. You might have problems going on in the house, or you may have one of the spouses having an affair with somebody in the workplace. And when they're coming in, with a blazing gun. They shoot up, and then a good chunk of the time they shoot themselves at the end of the process.
so does it seem like for workplace shootings then that the thing that triggers that event is more identifiable in comparison to school shootings?
Well, from our response to those, there was a feeling of injustice in the workplace, whether it's a supervisor or a co-worker, and the person was just pissed off, and they just went to a level that. So in law enforcement, we think they're all crazy.
Or they're all bad.
Well, everybody's bad, except for the cops, you know. And especially the lawyers. Did I say that this wrong?
You can say that, you're okay.
But the sense is that the person feels that they've been treated wrongly, and so they act out.
One more, go ahead.
I was wondering if the other panel members could respond to the original point of analogizing this to smoking in culture, and that as smoking, it's kind of just an ancillary thing to a movie, so like, it's not the point of the movie, smoking, whereas violence is often the point. It's both, I see there's 2 major problems with not all violence in movies, but in some movies that violence is shown as a solution to a problem and as a action without consequence. Like, the main character might kill 50 people and none of them matter, but then one person happens to die who is an ancillary character, and that death matters. And I just wonder if any other panels could respond to that.
Well, I don't think that I think that that there's a much closer analogy between smoking and shooting in movies and in television shows. To take movies for a moment, the movies are not about the killing. The theme in American movies is that conventional institutions are evil, and that individuals triumph over those by being unconventional and defying them. That's 50% or more of U.S. movies. Okay, so that's what Dirty Harry is about. That's what Rambo is about. That's what Die Hard is about. That's what Abe Lincoln, Lincoln is about. Okay, that's what we like to go see. Lincoln didn't shoot anybody in that movie that I remember. He got shot, but Lincoln was kind of a different sort of character amidst all these other people who were petty. So that's how Americans think about life. So that's what the message is about. And the shooting, or whether they have a lawyer or a psychiatrist on the show, is just a way to tell that story. Another kind of story you might tell is about somebody who is sort of tough and cool, and then you get a guy in Casablanca named Humphrey Bogart who smokes cigarettes. But it's not about the cigarettes or about the shooting. It's about some other kind of message. But there's, behavior that you see and people feel that they can emulate.
Well, so this is getting back now, we're sort of far from it, but Dr. Mostyn, your comments on Professor Stefani's evil sort of theory of this made me want to ask, can we say, or can you say as a psychiatrist, that if someone perpetrates a mass slaying, they have a mental illness?
No.
So there are some people who do this who don't have any kind of mental illness whatsoever?
I think, it is very hard, when a psychiatrist gets asked that kind of question, the reason that we're getting asked is that, people come to us for explanations about why things happen, about behavior that otherwise doesn't seem understandable. And our job is to try to rationalize or explain it. That's how I earn a living. But the reason that I don't think that mental illness is, an explanation is that there are all kinds of people with mental illnesses who don't do that. Most of the people who commit not only mass, multiple shootings, but individual ones are men. You can make me make a case out that there's something about your Y chromosome that makes you prone to do that, but lots of people here are men and don't do those things. So and that's the point that I would try to make. It's just not the mental illness itself, because the vast majority of people with mental illnesses don't do anything any more violent than the people here.
But that's not, and I agree to the extent that you can't say, well, because they have a mental illness, they will commit this. As you say, lots of people do have mental illness, they don't commit a crime like this. My question is, as far as your list of symptoms for what makes up any given mental illness, can you say that because they have this one symptom that they committed or because they did this one thing, they committed a mass slaying, that leads you to believe that they have some mental illness?
Well, I think the reason that one does turn to people like me or like Scott, with our professional degrees in these circumstances, is that you ask us questions when things seem irrational. Part of the reason I made the opening remarks I did is that I think that in addition to the white people, who are in malls and good schools and movie theaters who've been killed in these mass slayings and who are, innocent, there are lots of innocent people who live in neighborhoods like Price Hill and Avondale and Coreyville who are much more at risk and who are just as innocent and whom we ought to care about as well. And we don't think about, I do want to point out that we seem to classify killings into those that make sense and that are okay and normal killings, and then these abnormal ones with so-called innocent people who are involved.
As I contemplate suicide and homicide, it seems to me that on some level both of them are an atypical response to human suffering. I kill myself because I hate being alive, I want to die. I kill other people because they make me feel bad, or because I want to draw attention to my suffering, or because I want to somehow alleviate some kind of situation. So I wonder if in the confluence of impulse control and maladaptation to suffering, why is it that we're seeing a greater incidence of these kinds of incidences with men specifically?
If I could clarify one thing. It always fascinates me when we get on the topic of violence and shooting, we forget. We have a lot of sanctioned violence in our culture, right? We just fought 10 years of war where there were many people who engaged in mass shootings. Nobody thinks they're crazy, and nobody thinks what they did was wrong, oddly enough. And we have a lot of sanctioned violence, in a sense, in our own country, in gang warfare, where you could say mass shootings happen, but they're not out of some sort of personal angst, right? Personal despair, but they're motivated by other things.
I'm trying to do the thing. I think that gang violence seems to directly correlate to a perceived social imbalance, and that by killing people, you're maintaining your own power or increasing your power, which has to do with malady.
No, it does not. If you're in business as a cocaine dealer, you can't go to the police when somebody else invades your turf after you had a business agreement that that was not going to happen. The only recourse you have is to a threat or actual violence. So the reason that people in those circumstances act violently is that they need to stand their ground. That's why out in the wild, wild west, there were rates of violence that were very high in the 19th century because there wasn't available law enforcement, and the only way you could protect yourself was to be known as a dude with whom one did not mess around. And probably a dude who didn't use the word whom.
Another way, another kind of legal angle on what Doug was saying was that cocaine dealers tend to enter into unenforceable contracts, right?
Now, to get back to your last point, though, actually the rates of violence have gone down drastically over the centuries and even since I was a kid. There's more and more civilization, more and more law enforcement, and people have to turn to violence, and they do turn to violence a lot less. Doesn't mean it doesn't still happen, but Steven Pinker has a great book about this written in 2011, Better Angels of Our Nature, that really provides great documentation of how that's the case and why that's the case. I believe we've got a...
Yeah, we're at a point that we're having a discussion with, but I want to thank, first of all, Luther Fellows for helping us put the program together today. I think we had some lively discussion. I think you all had an opportunity to at least perceive what the issues are, and hopefully carry into further discussion. And if you can stay around afterwards if there are questions.